Shalom, my bitches. Myandis here with NFY, bringing you I Used to Write Horror Stories by Podge Writes. I used to write horror stories. Actually, that's not strictly accurate. I used to write horrific, pulpy, unbelievably awful stories, which only individuals as depraved as myself would ever take any pleasure from reading, let alone writing. Imagine the greatest sins you could possibly commit. Something so against your own nature that it seemed an abomination from its very inception. Imagine what you could never do to even your most disliked enemy, and you have an inkling of the type of filth I wrote. My work had been banned on every world they would go in for banning books, and I have been politely advised by certain government bodies to avoid publishing my work on several planets that don't. So imagine my surprise when an actual government representative from the Office of Extra-Species Affairs, no less, arrived on my doorstep with a request. In no uncertain terms, he asked me to come up with the most horrific alternate history for our planet I could possibly imagine. Something so sublimely awful that it would give hardened criminals nightmares. The only condition was that, in the end, it had to square up more or less with how our civilization has panned out in the modern day. Well, that seemed just fine to me. I asked him how believable it had to be. He actually blanched at that, though I didn't know why at the time, and informed me that it didn't need to be believable at all. In fact, the more outlandish and seemingly impossible it was, the better. Then he offered me a very sizable paycheck, told me where I could send the script, and left. Well, who was I to turn down such an interesting request? Or the money, for that matter. I powered up my slate and began to write. I really let loose, even throwing in a few scenes that would give me nightmares. At least at the time. A few weeks later, I had a first draft that touched upon pretty much every major world event I would recall from history lessons, but with the darkest imaginable twists, turns, and horrors. I submitted the piece, and was rejected within the day. Too tame, I was told. Not enough horror. Not enough mindless violence. Well, at this point, I started to take things seriously. This was practically an affront to my professional integrity, after all. I took back the script, reworked it completely, and resubmitted it. Again it came back with major revisions. The right direction, they said, but still too mild. The characters were too comprehensible, the violence too sedate, the overall themes too positive. I couldn't believe it at first. To my mind, this was some of my most outrageous work. But I stuck with it. Weeks passed, until at last I awoke one late afternoon to the same government rep at my door. I still wasn't getting it, apparently. He wanted to show me something that would open my eyes to what exactly it was I should be aiming for. He brought me to what amounted to a bunker annex of a high-security station somewhere I'm not allowed to say. We went through a myriad checks, scans, and more. They mostly seemed concerned that I might be carrying any kind of recording device, or any way to copy or transmit data. Satisfied I wasn't, they showed me into a room with a single book sitting on a table, surrounded by more security than I'd seen in some banks. They gave me an empty bucket and a jug of water, and left. Less than 10 minutes later, I found out what the bucket was for. An hour later, and I'd found at least 2 more uses for it. They eventually pulled me out, raving and sick and in the midst of a panic attack. They were impressed. Apparently I'd read more of the damn thing in one sitting than most individuals could stand to know of at all. They gave me some time to clean up, But even then, I knew what I'd read would stay with me for the rest of my life. It was made none the better for being fiction. Just knowing a mind out there could conceive of such madness was enough. When I was ready, they took me to another room. My handler, the guy from the Office of Extra Species Affairs, sat down opposite me and began to talk. He started talking about a new species they'd discovered, and explained that they were responsible for the book. "Well," said I, "that species has a pretty fucked up imagination. Maybe leave them right where they are, no?" That wasn't an option, he explained. They hadn't been contacted yet, but had recently discovered the Quinton particle, and thus would likely figure out FTL within a generation. "Well then," I said, "don't let them publish any more books." There I was, a victim of censorship myself, promoting the same for a fellow author. But to be honest, I was having a hard time considering whoever vomited up that garbage as a colleague. It was the most horrendous thing I'd ever read. Death of millions, billions even. Nuclear energy turned into bombs, used inside atmospheres, on populated cities. The book described a species that invented cars before they invented computers that could drive them safely. Hell, they invented air travel before they invented parachutes. I'd had to check the appendix of the damn thing to find out what concepts like rape, incest, spree killing, and genocide even were. My gods, genocide. I was an amateur. This author was in a different league entirely, and he was welcome to stay there. Why the hell did they even get me to try to match this crap in the first place? I asked. What was this? Some kind of cross-species literary pissing contest? That's when he dropped it on me. The book wasn't a work of fiction. Despite incredulity by every being who had ever studied it, the damn thing was in fact an actual history of a real species. And this race, these fucking monsters were about to break out of their own system and start wandering around habitable, civilized star systems. The whole thing, the frankly ludicrous notion of getting me to write a horrific alternative to our own history, was part of some grand first contact scheme the Conclave had cooked up. They had me write it because they were going to present it to this species as our actual history, in the hopes that they'd believe it and think they were dealing with a species capable of the same shit they were. All this because the thinking went, if they knew what comparative wimps we were, we'd be next. The next fucking genocide they'd attempt. Actually, they already had a word for it. Xenocide. The wiping out of an alien race. These fuckers hadn't even met an alien race yet, and they'd already had the vocabulary in place for killing every last one of us. Shit like that really puts the wrongs of our kind into perspective. What was one infamous lunatic accidentally pushing 2 people to their deaths while fleeing an incorrect change incident in light of the existence of something like nerve gas? This particular comparison was fresh in my mind, as the centennial memorial service of the Vonnegut massacre had just been the month before. Anyway, I bugged right out of the bunker. No way was I going to be involved in that crazy plan, and no way would it work in the first place. A species like that would smell the fake a mile off, then probably eat whoever presented it to them. I can't believe I just wrote that. A line about one sentient eating another. I could have gotten a whole book out of that back when I was writing. Do you know they even have a word for eating a member of their own species? Cannibalism. It's apparently common enough they needed a word for it. I'm sorry, but if you didn't want to know that, you should have quit a paragraph back. So, like I said, I used to write horror. After that incident, I packed up everything I had, which was not a lot, and hightails it to the far side of the galaxy. The way I see it, it's only a matter of time until these fuckers get out. And I don't see any plan involving telling them we can measure up to their sheer vulgar insanity panning out. So I fled. And you should too. Oh, and a last piece of advice. If anyone ever hands you a book called A Brief History of Earth, don't read it. You'll spend the rest of your life checking around every corner for humans. Alright guys, I hope you all enjoyed that. Leave me a like if you did. Leave me a comment if you got something you need to talk to me about. If you want to see more of my stuff, subscribe, and if you would like me to show up directly in your subscription feed, hit the bell right next to it. Have a nice one, y'alls.